Welcome, class, to week 3 in the course. This week, we're going to be talking about traditional methods of identification. You'll recall that up until now, we've been talking about important overview ideas, such as the idea that the constructs that you want to identify should match your definition of what it means to be gifted. Today, we're going to switch gears and get down into some of the mechanics of how students are traditionally identified for gifted and talented programs and services throughout the country. Now, it must be emphasized that these are the traditional stages of identification. Later in the course, we're going to learn about some ways to do things a little bit differently that might result in more underrepresented students being identified. But today we're going to get started with the nuts and bolts. How are students usually identified? You can think of traditional identification as being divided into 3 stages. Stage 1 is either nomination or also possibly universal screening. We'll get into what that means. Stage 2 usually consists of some type of individualized assessment for individual students who pass through stage 1. And finally, stage 3 is the assembling of a team of competent professionals to assess the data that's been collected, make the placement decisions, and place the student if gifted and talented services are offered within the district. So these are the 3 stages. A good best practice, even in traditional identification, is to cast as wide a net or as large a net as possible to find as many students as possible. As we've seen in previous weeks through some of our fun quizzes, gifted students may not always express themselves in the same way. So, for example, think about a gift or a talent in drama or acting and how Lucille Ball was turned down. So, you hear these stories all the time that gifted students who are gifted in different ways may not be seen as gifted because we tend to view giftedness through very traditional lenses. Students who are good students who get straight A's, who have neat and tidy handwriting and are organized, who always do their homework on time. These are traditionally the students who are identified for gifted programs. But if we only look for those students, we may be leaving out the Einsteins, the Lucille Balls, or even the students who may not rise to those levels, but who have gifts and talents that we need to identify. So first we ask the question, who usually does the identification process? So often it starts with the classroom teacher, or sometimes the parent will start the process. Maybe you're teaching a class and you notice one student is always raising her hand, and she's always the one that's offering the particular insights that intrigue you. Maybe she's asking a lot of questions. She's very interested. Maybe her grades aren't the best, but you know there's something there. So in this case, you might choose to nominate that student to be assessed for a gifted program. Sometimes, though, it is the parent. In some districts, the parent is also allowed to nominate. And we'll get into reasons for that later. As the process continues, a child study team may be formed to assess the student, and particularly the data that are collected on the student. This child study team varies from district to district, and sometimes it's not called a child study team, but usually includes the classroom teacher. If there's a gifted coordinator, it probably includes him or her. It may include an administrator, and it may include a school psychologist and or school counselor. It may include other individuals as well, but these are usually the core team members. Let's talk about that first stage, or stage 1, which is universal screening and or nomination. So in this first stage, what you're trying to do is to create a talent pool of students who will be given further consideration. So what you want to do is say, okay, I'm going to start by considering everybody in the school and give them an equal shot at this. You don't just focus on one student. It's best when you look at multiple data points, as we've said before. So in this stage, you're going to be implementing a couple probably basic screening instruments. Now, there's a difference between universal screening and nomination. Some schools do both, have universal screening and nomination. Some schools don't do universal screening, but will only do nomination, which will be problematic, as you'll see in a few minutes. But let's cover what these two things are. Universal screening is when you gather group or individual data on aptitude and achievement. So think of aptitude as the ability to do something. Maybe the student hasn't been taught, but they have an aptitude for it. So, for example, if you think of a young Tiger Woods, he probably had an aptitude for golf even before he was taught because he had inherent skill sets. So they're looking for aptitude, and IQ is an aptitude, by the way, or achievement, which is showing what you know. So achievement would be things like report card grades and getting good grades on some of the state tests by showing what you've been taught. So universal screening means you look at everybody's scores on these things throughout the whole school. That's what the word universal implies. Examples vary of the kinds of tests or assessments that you'll look at, but they might include state tests or a group IQ test that's called COGAT, and that stands for the Cognitive Abilities Test. So usually the school will have something that's given to everybody, and they'll say, okay, let's look at that uh, set of data, the scores, and pull the top 10% of students on that. And that's called universal screening because you look at everyone. Nomination, on the other hand, means that one person, usually a parent or a teacher, says, you know what, I think there's something in this particular student. And they'll fill out a rating scale or a checklist and submit it to usually a guidance counselor or a school psychologist. And that'll kick the whole process off for further assessment of that student. Now, schools that only do nomination and not universal screening are much more likely to have one kind of student that winds up in their gifted program, if they have a gifted program. And you can probably guess what kind of student this is. They're more likely to be white, they're more likely to be male, and they're more likely to be very strong straight A students. And so we encourage as a best practice universal screening because it casts that wider net. You might have that student that you're not even thinking about for the gifted program, and all of a sudden their score on a state test will jump out at you and say, oh my goodness, where did this come from? It's a flag. It's a way to cast a wider net and make sure that it's not just left up to one person. So here's an example of a parent nomination rating form. You can see it said this might be a form that is sent home to parents, and parents might be encouraged to fill it out. If it's going to be sent home, it should be sent home in the parent's native language. So it says, please check one column after each of the following statements that best describes your child. When have you observed this characteristic? 1, imagines things to be different than the way they actually are, wonders what if, what would happen. And the parent has to check how often they've seen that. This is a way for parents who often know their children the best to nominate them to gifted programs and for further assessment, I should say. Now, this is only one form. There are many, many. If you Google gifted parent nomination forms, you'll find probably dozens or hundreds on the internet. But this would be an example of what might be sent home in terms of a rating form. Sometimes, instead of a rating form where they have to say 1, 2, 3, 4, they'll use a checklist. So this is an example of a teacher nomination form. This might be something a teacher fills out and sends to a guidance counselor that says, I think we need to take a further look at this student. He or she might be assessed as gifted. So you can see, check the following, how many of these applied, displays a great deal of curiosity about a variety of things, etc. This is called a checklist rather than a rating scale because you see it doesn't have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 where you have to rate how often or how much of something. But whether they are checklists or rating scales and whether teachers or parents fill them out, this is the type of form that is used to kick off stage 1 in some districts. Now, some of the things that should be considered when a school district is planning on these nomination forms is that they should ask themselves some questions. So, are the checklists and rating scales used aligned with the definition of gifted and gifted programs? So, let's say you have a school district that defines giftedness as a lot of creativity and leadership. Well, the checklists and rating scales should align with whether a student is creative or gifted or a creative or a leader. And those programs and services should also reinforce that we're going to teach students about creativity and about leadership. Another question to ask is, can someone other than the teacher nominate? It's a well-researched phenomenon in the field that if we only allow the teacher to nominate, many students get overlooked. That's why it's so important or crucial to have parents nominate. In some school districts, community members can even nominate. Let's say I am a Girl Scout leader, and I see one of my troop members has really taken off in leadership. In some school districts, they're allowed to submit a form. Are necessary adaptation made, for example, for ELL? So this would be an example of sending the form home in the parent's native language. A parent can't fill that form out if they can't read it. Does the nomination process occur with enough frequency to catch newcomers? So what will frequently happen in districts is that they'll only allow nominations to take place in second grade, let's say, and in sixth grade. And if a student moves in who's gifted in third grade, then they have to wait until sixth grade to be assessed and to qualify for any programs and services. So it's a good idea to at least have some process in place, universal screening, for example, where this happens on an annual basis. Is information regarding this step made publicly available to all parents? So best practices dictate that there be a website for this. In Florida, it was under the special education website because gifted and talented actually fell under special education. Forms should be sent home regularly in parents' language, etc. So that's stage 1. What happens at stage 2? In stage 2, you examine the pool of students created from the nomination process more closely to determine whether they're fitted for the gifted identification. And you gather additional data. So let's say you do universal screening and you decide to look at the top 10% of all scorers on your COGAT and on your ITBS, which is an achievement test that some school districts give in math and reading. So you gather those, that's your talent pool. And so what you start to do is assess those students further. You take the original data gathered during the nomination process and add to it. You're going to try to create a student profile. So additional scores might be added. You might get aptitude scores on other types of tests, achievement scores, teacher ratings like we talked about before. Those rating scales might go into it. You might do a record review for grades. You might look at their portfolios. Any other relevant data may be added depending on the emphasis of the program. And again, what you're looking at here is whether it aligns with your definition and with your programs and services. So there's no need to collect mathematics achievement data if your program is not about mathematics or includes no components of mathematics. There's no need to collect creativity data if you're not emphasizing creativity in your program. Students may be individually assessed by individual screening instruments such as the KBIT-2. So in a previous lecture, I mentioned the KBIT-2. That stands for the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test, and it's sort of a mini IQ test. So a teacher might say, go to a class and say, okay, 2 of these students were identified by universal screening, and pull them out one at a time and administer a KBIT-2. If that is successful, they might even follow up with a full-blown IQ test if IQ is a part of the consideration for the school district, such as the WISC. The WISC is a full-blown IQ test that has to be administered by a trained school psychologist. And other assessments might be added. So there might be achievement tests that are thrown in. Sometimes it can get a bit ridiculous. In their haste to minimize the number of students identified as gifted, um, many districts will inadvertently add way too many assessments here and not think about, okay, what construct are we trying to identify for? Whatever it is at this stage, the process should be the standard for each student. You can't give one student a full-blown IQ test and say to another, oh, you don't need that, we know you're smart. It has to be the same in order to be accountable to parents and other stakeholders. Now, there are some other screening considerations. As we said, does the screening process contribute meaningful data that aligns with the definition and program? I can't emphasize this enough. Don't add tests just for the sake of adding tests. It should add something to the overall profile of the student. Fill out the picture. So if you're assessing for creativity because your definition contains creativity, it's perfectly fine to throw in a creativity test, such as the Torrance creativity test. But otherwise, it just takes time and resources to leave it out. And that gets to the second bullet. How efficient is the screening process? Some districts get themselves so wrapped around the axle that it takes dozens of hours to assess one student, and it's just not supportable in that way. So you have to be efficient, you have to get at what you're looking for, and you have to assess students that way. Does the process give a fair shot to all students who are in the nomination pool? And again, this is about doing the same thing to everyone in a way that students can understand it. So, for example, if a student doesn't understand English, you shouldn't be giving the tests in English because that wouldn't fairly assess his or her aptitude or abilities. Do the instruments capture the full extent of the child's abilities? Some instruments have low ceilings. We've touched on this a bit before. You know how some students actually take the SAT in 7th grade so that their true abilities can be assessed because it has a high test ceiling. If the things on the test are too easy for gifted students, you might not be able to see the full range of their abilities. Are parents and guardians and students fully informed of this step? So as I've mentioned before, usually at this step, when you start taking students and individually assessing them, using a process that's not for all the students, you almost always have to get parent permission. And the parents have to be fully informed of why you're asking to do this, what's the reason, what's the outcome. If their child qualifies, what's the outcome if the child doesn't qualify? It needs to be written in language that the parent can understand. Note that this is different than what usually occurs at the first stage. So universal screening, you don't have to get parental permission for that because all the students in the school are taking, let's say, the COGAT, or all the students are taking the ITBS or state tests. Whatever it is you're doing with all students, there's not a special permission. But once you start down the path of looking at the student individually, that's where the district usually requires parental permission. And there will be some parents who say, no, you don't have my permission. At that time, the assessment must stop. And finally, is parental input solicited? So even at stage 2, if you haven't, especially if you haven't done parent nomination, that's where you would send home a checklist or rating scale and ask parents for information that you can assemble for the team to select. Stage 3 is selection and placement. This is where you've gathered all your data, and now the child study team must meet and consider all the data and ask themselves two questions. One, does this student exhibit characteristics that would warrant our particular gifted services? And hopefully you've aligned your tests and assessments, your instruments with your definition. It all matches and with your services. And finally, which service option, if you offer one, are best suited to the student? So with this student, let's say you have three things you can offer the student: full-time placement in a gifted classroom, pull-out enrichment services, and perhaps just some additional mentoring in the classroom. Which one of those might best match the student's academic and social emotional needs? Now, while the child study team is meeting, there are certain things they're going to consider. So obviously, hopefully all the parents and guardians and students have been fully informed and permission has been obtained. Now, one thing that is something to think about is that some districts use matrices where they assign a score to an assessment and students earn points for higher score. So let's say you gave 5 tests to this student. You gave an IQ test, or rather you had used 5 data points. You gave an IQ test, you looked at students' grades, you maybe gave 2 achievement tests, and you did a teacher rating scale. And they could earn points for each one of those. Higher scores mean higher points. And let's say the highest possible score they could get was a 45 if you add all those things up. Some districts will come in and say, okay, you've got to get at least a 40. So if a student adds all those things up and gets between a 40 and a 45, that's called a cutoff, they'll qualify for a gifted program. However, best practice is not to do that, not to create these scores, and certainly not to add them in a matrix. And there are lots of people who study tests and assessments, and the reasons they give is it was never meant to be like that, that when you're creating a number assigned to a score value in a test, you're creating something artificial. And so it's just arbitrary, the numbers you're assigning and how you're adding them. And then you're adding another arbitrary point, which is a cutoff. So although this is common practice, it's really frowned on in identification and placement. Do not set too high a barrier with the and rule. So I've seen districts, like I said, go crazy, and they'll have 10 tests and say they have to score X on test A and Y on test B and Z on test C, and they wind up with 2 students identified, as I've often said, usually white students and male. And so you can't do that if you want to cast a wider net for other types of talents, and you can't do that if you want to cast a wider net in terms of diversity. Additional data may need to be collected after the team reviews the student portfolio. So for example, you might say, okay, well, this student is sort of iffy. I'm sort of on the fence about this student. Let's go out and give him the SAT. Let's give him this, something that will have a higher ceiling so we can really see what that student's ability is. This week, you're going to be studying a case study about an actual school district in Pennsylvania called the Pottstown School District. Now, Pottstown does what I suggested not be done, which is they use a matrix, and there are some assessments that they give at each stage. So I'm going to ask you to read through that case study and then think about what's good about their assessment process and what maybe they could improve. And you're going to do some analysis on that. So what did we learn today? We've learned that that traditional identification consists of 3 stages: nomination and/or universal screening, individual screening, and then finally selection and placement. We've learned that identification constructs, the things that you're identifying for, math ability, reading ability, creativity, whatever it is, should match the district's definition of gifted and talented students. And then that should flow into programs and services, that golden rule coming back again and again and again. We've also learned by a lot of different rules the process should be fair and accessible to all students, and I will also add to their parents. So everybody have a great week.